Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to go over some do's and don'ts in painting foliage. Let's get started. The first do is to start out with big shapes. You want to make sure that your bushes or foliage as a whole can be recognizable just by their silhouette. Therefore, when I start my foliage painting, I always use a big flat brush. It makes me concentrate more on the bigger shape of the bush itself instead of going into the little details at the beginning stages where I just want to block in the overall structure of the bush. And so on the opposite side of that, we have our don't, which is go straight into painting every single leaf at the very beginning. It is very easy to get lost into all of these little leaves while you don't really know where they start and where they end, or how they even interact with each other as a whole. As you can see right now, I look kinda lost just putting down a bunch of different leaf strokes without having any structure in mind, and adding more detail to this wouldn't make it any better. Now, there is a bit of an exception to this when it comes to painting very close up and very detailed macro foliage, like this one right here on the screen. I will talk more about this exception toward the end of the video, so make sure to stick around to know how I painted this flower bush if you're interested. Once we have that silhouette down, the next do is to use a range for our shadows and light. Here, while still focusing on the big shapes, I use a bright green to mark down where the light is going to be on this bush. And as you can see, this green is lighter than the mid-tone color that I put down previously. However, it's still relatively close in terms of value to that mid-tone color. Let's say on the scale value, if the mid-tone green is a 5, this green is close to a 4 or a 3. Because I want the transition from dark to light to be gradual. And so after putting down that bright green, now I'm mixing the mid-tone color again to try and blend the two colors in even more. And now I'm going to do the same for a darker green to create the shadow part. Again, this green is only 1 or 2 value darker than the mid-tone green. And after I add this dark green in, I'm going to try and also blend it in with the mid-tone color like what we did with the brighter green. And by doing so, I have more of a gradient transition from shadow to light. And so an example of what we do not want to do is to create an abrupt value transition. If you have a really dark background like this and then you go straight in painting a bunch of leaves in this kind of brighter green color, it makes those leaves look like they don't really belong to that bush. And it also makes your painting look very flat. Moreover, because we don't really have any transition from dark to light, now if we're adding the lighter part on each of the leaves, it makes the painting look cartoonish, as if we're just gluing those leaves onto a dark flat wall. On the other painting, while we have the light and shadow area nicely structured and transition very gradually, it is very easy to add in the details in a coherent way. Essentially, all I'm doing here is adding 1 or 2 leaves kind of grouped together. While it's in the shadow, I would make those leaves look darker, and as I move towards the lighter area, I would make those leaves look lighter. You want them to just be slightly darker than your background color so they stand out, but they should still fall into about the same value range at your background area. The next thing to avoid is making your details look even or uniform. Nature is generally more chaotic. Not every leaf looks the same. They don't have the same colors. Some have more light, some have less light. Some may pointing downward, some may pointing upward, some larger, some smaller, and they are definitely not evenly distributed like the one in this particular painting that I'm doing right now. By painting those leaves like that, I make my bush look a little fake, as if it's made by human and it's not really by nature itself. And to be honest, it doesn't really look like a bush at all. What we want to do instead is to create chaos in a very structural way. And what I mean by structural is that we already have where the dark and the light area is going to be. We are not going to add very light leaf at the very bottom of this bush because that's where the shadow is, and vice versa, we're not going to add very dark leaf at the top where the highlight is going to be. For this particular bush, the leaves that I decided to add are kind of small and pointing one, and so most of them is going to have this characteristic. I'm not going to add a very big maple leaf shape on top of this bush because it would look out of place. However, I do want chaos, and to do that, I varying the leaf orientation. Some of them you can see pointing toward the left, some point toward the right, some point a little downward, some point more upward, some a little bit larger than the other. Some stay in group of 2, while some others stay in group of 3 or 5. And to avoid evenly distributing the leaf, I'm constantly jumping around. So if I add some leaf on the bottom right, I would then immediately go up and add some on the top left, so that I'm not unconsciously create an even distribution in a certain area, because our human brain is interesting. We like structure, we like things that look uniform and symmetric. And so by jumping around constantly, I'm tricking my brain not to form any pattern when I add in these detail leaf. The next do is to use highlights sparingly. We want the highlights to be a very light color that create contrast and focus in our foliage. And in order to create that contrast and focus, those highlights need to be rare. As you can see right now, I'm creating just 1 or 2 strokes, very small in only certain area. The more highlights that we add, the less special they become. In this particular painting, you will see the effect of just adding highlights everywhere. So as I started out, you can see the left hand side start looking a little bit more stand out compared to the right one. But now when I go all the way to the right and adding that highlight to every leaf, everything looked the same, and those highlights just kind of become another mid-tone color. And our last do is to take other things around the bush into consideration. Now if your light source on your bush is, in this case, from the top left, and you wanted to paint a tree behind the bush, your light source from that tree also need to be on the top left. The light that affect your bush also is going to affect things around it. And that not only affect where the light area is going to be, it also affect how light and what color that area is going to be. As you can see here, I'm trying to get the highlight on the tree about as bright as the highlight on the bush, and also the shadow on the trees about as dark as the shadow on my bush. It would look weird if the shadow on the tree is way darker or just way lighter than the color on the bush itself. And finally, I'm just adding a couple leaves overlapping the tree. Then we have our final painting. So remember when I say that there is an exception in adding the details at the very beginning stages when it comes to painting very detailed and very close-up macro foliage. In some of these cases, you don't even have any big shape or structure to start out with. So a lot of the time, what I end up doing is that I would put down the background color first, and I make this background color the darkest value in the whole painting. And after that, I'm going to paint the individual leaf right away. This may sound like the opposite of everything I've been talking about. However, even in this case, I still follow every do's and don'ts that we discussed previously, it's just on a different level. Remember in our bush painting, we say we're gonna use gradual transition instead of abrupt one. Well, in this case, we are going to do that too by adding multiple layers of different leaf, starting from the darker one and slowly build up to the lighter one. As you can see right now, the leaf that I'm adding is only slightly lighter than the background, because I still want to make that transition from dark to light very gradually. And just like what we did previously, even for this leaf, I'm only focusing on the silhouette of them. I'm not adding any detail to each individual leaf, but instead what I'm doing is just adding big leaf shape kinda randomly distributed over the painting. Even though these leaves have relatively similar shape, I do want to create chaos like we discussed previously. So as you can see here, I'm jumping over the place when I'm adding these leaves to avoid an even distribution. And I also vary the size and the orientation of those leaves. Some are slightly bigger, some are slightly smaller, some in group of 3, some in group of 2, and some even in group of 7. Not only that, I also changed the green hue of them slightly. Even though I'm trying to keep the value the same, they are pretty similar in their darkness, but I sometimes add a little bit more blue, sometimes I make it a little bit warmer, just so that there's some variation in the color of the leaf to make them look more natural. After that, I'm mixing a lighter green to add a new layer on top of everything. And in this new layer, I'm going to make these lighter leaves overlap the darker one to create more depth in the painting. I am not afraid of covering a lot of what I have added previously. This is another reason why you don't want to add details to your previous layer, because you're more likely going to cover them anyway. And just like the darker leaf, again right now I'm just adding the silhouette of this leaf. I'm not adding any detail texture on them or even adding any light or shadow on them. The light and shadow is already determined by us adding this new layer, because we have a gradual transition from the dark background to a slightly lighter bottom layer of leaf, and now we're adding some lighter layer of leaf on top of that. You definitely don't want to cover everything underneath. Some of them still need to show through to create depth, but just don't be afraid to paint over what you created previously. And again, I know I say this a lot, but the less detail you added to your previous layer, the more likely you be okay with just, covering them all. And again, all of this doesn't just apply to leaf. Previously, if we have to take the tree next to the bush into consideration, in this case, we'll have to take anything around this leaf into consideration. And in my case, it will be the flowers. I am going to paint the flower pretty much the same way I painted those leaves, as in I would start out with the darker one first. And then after that, I will create a new layer with the lighter flower that again will overlap the darker one. This will help create the depth in the painting and also make everything more consistent. And just like the leaf, I also want to vary the sizes and the orientation of this flower. They are not pointing all in the same direction, and their position on the painting is also not evenly distributed. Keep in mind that we still want structure within all this chaos. And in my case, the structure is that a lot of the flower are pointing toward the left-hand side. Even though their orientation is slightly different, some angle a little bit more upward, some angle more horizontal, and some angle more downward, they're all generally facing the left side. This will help create a flow in the painting and show what angle we're looking at the bush from. I do add a little bit of a lighter color on top of this dark flower just because of how hydrangea flower works is that they are made up of multiple different flowers. So if I just add the silhouette alone, it wouldn't look like a hydrangea flower. So I'm adding a slightly, just a little bit lighter color on top of this flower that are in the shadow. And what you notice is that now while I'm adding the next layer of the flower, the lighter layer, the dark part of these lighter flower is still lighter than the light part of those darker flowers. Now, only after the silhouette and the structure of everything has already been blocked in, as you can see right now, is when I'm actually going in and starting to add the little details. And even for these little details, we still want to maintain our do's and don'ts. I'm still gradually building up the lighter part of this flower by adding multiple layers on top of them, starting out with a color that only slightly lighter than the mid-tone color we added previously, and we'll slowly increasing that brightness over time to make the transition from dark to light more gradual. And in this case, to create a little bit of chaos, I'm not using the same color throughout. Sometimes I'm adding a little bit more blue, other times I'm adding a little bit more red to change the purple hue that I'm adding on this flower slightly, making them again looking slightly more natural. And now we're going to add details to the leaf by following the same set of rules, keeping the transition gradual, make things more chaotic, yet still consistent with everything we added previously, and use highlight sparingly. And there we have our final paintings. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, please consider likes and subscribe. Leave a comment down below, it really helped me out a lot. Other than that, I will see you in the next video. Bye!